Someone responded to the last Q&A asking whether philosophy can replace God with, you can't replace something that never existed in the first place. So I said, in that case, neither does philosophy. It's just an idea of an idea, worse, someone's idea of an idea. And they said, philosophy actually exists. The field of study is active, papers get published, evidence philosophy exists, scholars, their writings, the fact that we're talking about it, and then they challenge the question itself, can philosophy replace God? And said the question would have been valid had I said religion instead of God. Okay, sure. But what exactly do you mean by exist here? Because that's a much bigger question than it first appears. And unless we define our terms, we're probably just going to talk past one another. Point case. So let's grant the standard they proposed for a moment and see whether it can bear the weight of the claim made. Philosophy exists because there are scholars, books, papers, discussion. Great. By that same standard, God certainly exists as well and has for thousands of years. In fact, God is one of the oldest and most widespread subjects in human history. People were talking about God in some capacity way before we have any record of them philosophizing. So that criterion doesn't actually distinguish philosophy from God. Perhaps then what you really mean is something else. Perhaps you mean that only we can physically perceive. What we can perceive physically exists. But science doesn't operate that way either. Science begins by acknowledging that our perception is limited. That's why pilots trust instruments. That's why doctors use MRIs. That's why astronomers use telescopes. That's why, as someone who spent years recording music, I know you can't trust your ears forever. Eventually you experience ear fatigue in as little as 45 to 1.5 hours of continuous listening, and your objectivity diminishes. Your hearing changes, your perception changes. So you use meters. Instruments don't replace perception, they correct it. Science isn't built on trusting our senses. It's built on extending them. Even in ordinary English, it's never defined existence that narrowly. Merriam-Webster begins to have real being, whether material or spiritual. Whether material or spiritual, it says. It recognizes what ordinary language has always recognized. The existence has never been limited to physical matter alone. Then, think about Jesus. Not God as an undefined concept, Jesus. A historical person. He occupied space and time. He interacted with people. He changed history. Whether someone believes he rose from the dead is irrelevant. His historical existence is accepted by the overwhelming majority of historians. So, again, the criterion still doesn't distinguish philosophy from God. Okay, then let's take the one definition of exist that Merriam-Webster has that could be argued if we reject the resurrection. To have life or functions and vitality. Jesus came and went, so he no longer exists. We have to defend that definition on its own merits, and under this one, every person in history ceases to exist with God and Jesus. Eventually, this route leads you into a swamp of solipsism. If existence becomes only whatever I can personally see, touch, taste, hear, or feel, then eventually the only thing I'm really certain exists is me. Science exists precisely because that's not enough. It constantly corrects our perception through evidence, instruments, mathematics, and the testimony of others. But even if someone sincerely believed God didn't exist, why would that make God unworthy of discussion? So, because God doesn't exist, the question of whether philosophy could replace God is pointless. We discuss morality, justice, consciousness, beauty, free will, possible futures, fictional worlds, hypothetical technologies, mathematical objects. Questions don't become meaningless simply because people disagree about whether the subject is ultimately real. So why do we apply that standard to God alone? Maybe the deeper issue isn't whether God exists. Maybe it's the presuppositions we bring to the question before we've even begun asking it. The whole point of contrasting God to philosophy was with regard to what works for depression. And a presupposition prevented that connection from being made. Every worldview has presuppositions. The question is whether they survive being applied consistently. That's what this conversation has really been about. Not proving God, testing assumptions. Because before we ask whether philosophy can replace God, we should know what we mean by God. We should know what we mean by philosophy. And we certainly should know what we mean by exist. Otherwise, we're not arguing about reality. We're arguing with our own undefined terms. And if your definition only works until it's applied consistently, perhaps the problem isn't the conclusion. Perhaps it's the definition. And that's how presuppositions are tested.